So for today, I chose to present a relatively older project from my Purdue years because I think it's a good piece of the puzzle that we are exploring in this symposium. I'm going to be talking about view clarity towards visual satisfaction. So I will start with an introduction and talk about the implications and challenges of window view studies, and then I will continue talking about clarity, roller shades, and what we aimed to find with this experiment, how we designed it, and what were the major takeaways. And towards the end, I want to just give you a brief overview of some ongoing projects here at UNL that are also related to window views from different aspects. So I want to start with this slide. This is something that I always show to my students. It's from my hometown in Athens, Greece. And this is the Acropolis Museum. It's a building that was built about 20 years ago. At the time, I was a sophomore in my undergraduate studies, and I was kind of looking around the construction. I was interested, and I really didn't get it until I saw this aerial view, and I realized what the architect had in mind. So you can see that the last floor of the museum is oriented and sized exactly as the Temple of Parthenon in the Acropolis. And if you think that the purpose of this last floor was to host the art that was on the surface of Parthenon, what the architectural team succeeded with this is for the visitors to walk around this last floor, see this art being lit with the correct daylit spectrum from the sun through this perimeter facade, and at the same time look at the scenery of Athens from an elevated point. So basically, this is just a good example of how one can use good daylighting and window views designed to promote the objectives of a space. So talking about view, there are so many parameters that are involved. We heard some from the previous speakers. I try to categorize the most major of them. With green color, we can see the ones that we can actually design for. So the geometry, the size of our windows, right? The clarity of our fenestration. The distance is something that we can design for, the distance of view, but yeah, it's also it's going to be impacted by surrounding environment, so it's not always standard that we will get what we designed for. Then with the yellow color, I wanted to show the subjective elements, how interesting the view is, how satisfying, how distracting it might prove, how well it helps us feel connected to the exterior, and how this might affect our feeling of privacy. Then with pink, I marked some direct implications of maximizing view. So maximizing view means maximizing daylighting. We might get more prone to glare. We also amplify the circadian effects of the exterior environment. And finally, another way to assess view as any other environmental factor is actually through its impact on the objectives of the human occupants of the space. So William talked about it in the beginning. We want to understand how view promotes our well-being, our attention, our productivity, and so on. And I'm sure there are other parameters that we will talk about in this symposium. I will focus on clarity. And why do we care about clarity? While in conventional windows, the most often met in buildings, double, triple glazed, clarity is usually not an issue. It can be an issue for special types of fenestration like free glass, diffuse glass, or maybe electrochromic glass in some cases. But when we have something like a roller shade, we can see that this can seriously compromise how clear we can see outside. And we want to be able to see clear outside at all cases, right? So here you see the example of 3 different roller shades and how they produce different perceptions of the exterior environment. In order to understand why this happens, we need to take a closer look on roller shades. What are roller shades? Are essentially perforated fabrics, right? So if we want to take a closer look here, we will see that it's a sequence of opaque and gap elements. Due to this physical construction of roller shades, we use 2 main major properties to identify them. One is the openness factor that basically expresses this width density. So when we have a high openness factor, we have a lot of gaps, and this is of course associated with a direct light transmission. And as we will see, this is very important for view outside. And then we have the visible transmittance that expresses the total light transmission through the fabric. And as we will see, it's also associated with the fabric color. So basically, lighter fabrics have usually higher visible transmittances. These two properties are, like I said, the ones that identify roller shades, so they can be found on the labels. This is how we design roller shades based on these properties. So we hypothesized that this should be important in terms of affecting clarity. So in order to investigate this hypothesis, we designed an experiment where we hosted 18 human subjects that reviewed 14 fabrics. We formed partitions in our labs, and we selected these 14 fabrics in a way that they cover the entire span of the most commonly used properties for openness factor and visible transmitters that are met in commercial buildings. We also wanted to investigate two sub-hypotheses here that were based on our everyday practice, that the observer distance would matter. So we tested two different distances, near and far from the window, and also that the exterior weather should matter, and we tested therefore sunny and cloudy days. We took special care in order not to include the sun in the field of view, because this will introduce different degrees of freedom in the experiment and would distract us from our main objectives. One of the most important challenges in this study is that we had to define what clarity means. So this was, as far as I know, one of the very first attempts to study this matter. So we didn't have anything to be based on. To dodge this challenge, we designed a diverse questionnaire where we tried to address clarity from different perspectives. So we started with a very subjective question that basically asked the subjects how clear they can see outside through the fabric. So this would introduce their own version of clarity in their own mindset, right? But then we became a little more specific. So we investigated the perception of colors, how vivid they appear, and how we can actually define what colors we can see. We introduced a visual acuity test based on the Landolt rings test, right? And we mounted charts outside and asked the subjects to tell us what they can see in randomized sequences. And finally, we asked whether they can see the sky conditions, or whether they can actually identify some selected areas, objects, or targets that were in their visual field. So we used the responses from these 6 questions to develop a scoring system for fabrics to identify their clarity performance. We also had 2 additional questions that were not used in the grading, but we included them just to help our understanding with preferences of people towards fabrics. What we got from this initial ranking with this scoring system were some initial results. First of all, we saw that black fabrics tended to rank the highest. We saw that openness factor would play a very significant role. So for fabrics with similar visible transmittances, when the openness factor was different, we had a very different ranking position. But we also identified a very complex interaction between those 2 factors. And while this seemed a little random, there was a structure hidden, which we tried to investigate in deeper analysis. What you can see here is a distribution of the responses for the sunny and cloudy days, and the bars that you can see reflect the colors of the fabric, and the density of the bars reflects the tightness of the fabric. So higher density means lower openness factor. The immediate things that we can see here is that, first of all, white fabrics tend to rank lower, black fabrics tend to rank higher, and also when the tightness increases, the openness factor decreases, then we have higher uncertainty. We also managed to actually prove our sub-hypothesis. So we saw that observer distance and the exterior weather do matter. However, the interaction was not significant, which allowed us to proceed with developing an index for our scoring through our scoring system. The reason for this is potentially that when we go near the shade, we have the construction of the shade more visible to us, which might distract us from the exterior environment. And also, when we have sunny weather outside, we might have some more contrast that could interfere with that. But these both need to be investigated in the next studies. Based on this scoring system, we developed this equation, the view clarity index, that is based on these two parameters that we hypothesized from the beginning that are important, the openness factor and the interaction of the openness factor with the visible transmittance. And this view clarity index is the first available metric that can predict clarity in our design based on the fabrics that we have. So using this, architects can have an understanding of what their suggestions will cause in terms of clarity of view outside. This index can also potentially be used as a correction factor for other positional or spatial quantifications of the amount of view. So here I just include an example of an index that we proposed, the effective outside view, that is based on solid angle and the size of view from the interior. So using such metrics, I think we are going to be talking about this next today. We can have a holistic evaluation of the space based on its design, controls, and layout. And also, this view clarity index needs to be extended to cover other sorts of fenestration, and we are actually actively working on that through the fenestration committee of ASRI to develop new projects that will actually be focused on other types of glass like Fried glass and also potentially Venetian blinds or even electrochromic windows. So this is what I wanted to present about clarity, and as I promised, I just wanted to bring to your attention two current projects that are going on at UNL. One has to do with the impact of view on student achievement. So this is part of a bigger project that wraps up now. It started about 4 years ago about the environmental effects on student achievement. It explored thermal, visual parameters, indoor air quality, and acoustics. But the reason I'm bringing this to your attention is that for 220 K-12 classrooms, we also try to understand how the view out practices of the latest European standard are connected with student achievement. And we found that there is a positive effect for the number of view layers that the standard proposes. We also have some importance of socioeconomical parameters, and this project is wrapping up now, and some publications will be coming soon. Another project that also investigates view from a different perspective is currently starting here, and it's about the investigation of human gaze behavior in office settings. So in order to understand the mechanics of view, we also want to understand why we use our view, how often we look at the window, why we look at the window, what are the parts of the window that prove to be more interesting, and in what sequences we are doing this. So using eye tracking, we aim to develop gaze behavior models that in turn could also address the limitations of most current glare metrics that, as you know, are based on the assumption that we are looking at one specific direction, which is not very realistic. So that's all I had to show you today. Thank you for having me here, and please feel free to give me some questions later. Just wanted to acknowledge my co-authors for the study of clarity, Dr. Thanos Gempelikos and Dr. Robert Proctor from Purdue, Dr. Ying-Tse Chan from National Taiwan University, Dr. Julia Seibold from RWTH Aachen, and Dr. Brent Pronsman from Lutheran Electronics. And I will see your questions later. Thank you.